Stop the car. Now. The words came out before I even realized I'd spoken, and Thomas's knuckles whitened on the wheel. The border was less than an hour ahead, and something in the air between our two cars had shifted from uneasy to dangerous. I could feel it in the silence, in the way Evie's SUV lingered behind us, and in the memory of that split-second look she had given me earlier, a look that didn't belong on the face of a sister planning a family weekend. I'm Maggie Lawson, and I've spent years stepping in for Evie, paying her bills, helping raise her daughter, keeping my questions to myself. But in that moment, every instinct I had told me I was about to cross more than a border. I was about to step into something I might not come back from. The cold morning air clung to my skin as we stepped out of the diner parking lot near the edge of Buffalo. I slid back into the passenger seat of our old Subaru, feeling the seatbelt lock across my chest, and glanced in the side mirror just as Evie's face came into view. It was only a flicker, but her eyes caught mine in the reflection. Sharp, almost startled, and gone in an instant, replaced by the faint smile she wore whenever she was trying too hard to look relaxed. Ryan was standing behind her, fiddling with his phone, but I caught the way his gaze shifted toward the blue suitcase sitting snug in our trunk. That suitcase wasn't ours. Evie had brought it by last night, setting it down in our living room like it was nothing, saying her car was too full with all of Lily's toys and snacks. It had seemed innocent enough at the time, though a little odd. Now, watching them in the mirror, something in my stomach tightened. Evie opened the rear door to check on Lily, her voice sing-song and warm. I could hear her asking if she needed more juice for the ride. Then she leaned forward, her eyes catching mine again over the headrest. Her smile didn't reach her eyes. "Remember to keep that suitcase close," she said softly, her tone casual but carrying a weight I couldn't quite name. "Don't open it, it's just Lily's things and they get jumbled so easily." She chuckled faintly as if she'd made a light-hearted joke, but my hands had gone still in my lap. I nodded, not trusting myself to say much, and she closed the door. Ryan gave Thomas a quick wave and stepped back toward their own car. My husband started the engine, the low hum filling the silence between us. The smell of burnt coffee lingered from the diner, but my mind was elsewhere, still turning over the brief look on Evie's face. It wasn't just the words. It was the way she said them, low and almost conspiratorial, like she didn't want anyone else to hear. And the way Ryan's eyes had darted between us, checking, measuring. I had known my sister all my life, through scraped knees, teenage heartbreaks, and the messy years after her first divorce. I knew the look she got when she was hiding something. I just couldn't yet place what it was. Thomas glanced at me as he pulled out of the parking lot. "You all right, hon? You've been quiet since we left the diner." I forced a small smile, trying to smooth the worry off my face. "Just thinking about Lily. She seemed a little pale this morning." Thomas nodded, eyes back on the road, and the tires hummed over the asphalt. Behind us, in their SUV, Evie's head was turned toward Ryan, her lips moving quickly. He kept one hand on the wheel, the other gesturing toward our car, and even from here I could tell the conversation was tense. I shifted in my seat, leaning my elbow against the window, the cold glass steady under my skin. The blue suitcase sat just a few feet behind me in the trunk, out of sight, but suddenly very present in my mind. I told myself it was nothing, that I was letting my imagination get ahead of me. But the last few months had been complicated. The distance, the sudden warmth in her voice last night when she invited us on this trip, it didn't fit with the way she had treated me since I refused to bail her out again. People don't change their tune that quickly unless they want something. We merged back onto the highway, the wide gray ribbon stretching north toward the border. Snow still clung to the grass along the median, stubborn patches left over from last week's storm. Thomas kept the heater low, just enough to keep the chill from settling into our bones. I watched the road signs tick by, the miles to the crossing narrowing with each minute. In the rear view, I caught Lily's small face in the back seat of their car, pressed against the glass. She was smiling, holding up a drawing for me to see, her little hand waving. I waved back automatically, my heart squeezing. Whatever tension sat between her parents and me, she was still just a child. That was what made the look in Evie's eyes all the more unsettling. It wasn't just about her, it was about Lily too. Thomas tapped the steering wheel lightly, glancing over again. "You're sure you're all right? You look like you're somewhere else entirely." I exhaled slowly, watching the horizon. "I'm fine. Just, something about this trip feels different, that's all. He didn't press, but I could see the question lingering in his profile. We passed a rest area sign, the blue and white arrow pointing to an exit we didn't take. The road was clear, the sky that washed out winter blue that never really promised warmth. Still, the knot in my stomach stayed tight. I told myself I'd think about it later after we got there. But deep down, I knew I was already thinking about it now, turning over every detail in my mind, every glance, every word. The hum of the tires was steady, but my heartbeat wasn't. I reached for the thermos at my feet, hoping a sip of coffee would steady me, and caught sight of the suitcase again in my mind's eye, sitting silent in the trunk waiting. Back in 2016, life looked different. Evie had just signed her divorce papers, her second-hand couch still sitting in the driveway of the little rental she was about to leave. She came to my kitchen one afternoon with puffy eyes and the smell of stale coffee clinging to her clothes, saying she was going to make a fresh start with the flower shop she had been dreaming about for years. I remember putting down my tea and telling her she could do it, that she had always been creative with her hands. By that summer, she had married Ryan, a man with a warm laugh and a knack for making people feel at ease, at least in those early days. He talked about how they would run the shop together, expand to weddings, maybe even have a delivery van with their logo on the side. I wanted to believe them. Thomas had just retired from the garage and I had stepped away from the elementary school where I had worked for decades. We had savings, a modest pension, and a house that was finally paid off. Helping her seemed like the most natural thing in the world. It started with covering a few late rent payments on the shop. She would call me on a Wednesday afternoon, voice low, explaining how the landlord had given her until Friday to make up the difference. I would write a check without thinking twice. Then it was a shipment of roses she needed for a big wedding order, but the supplier required payment up front. I remember driving her to the wholesaler in the next county, the two of us laughing as we loaded box after box of blooms into her trunk, our arms dusted with pollen. When Lily was born, my role in their lives deepened. Evie was determined to keep the shop going while raising her baby, so I stepped in wherever I could. I paid for daycare 3 days a week so she could work without distraction. I bought winter coats, sneakers, and the sparkly pink backpack Lily picked out for preschool. Every month there was something. A utility bill that had slipped through the cracks, an insurance premium that came due at the wrong time. Thomas would sometimes raise an eyebrow when he saw the check register, but he never told me to stop. He knew how I felt about family. There were nights when I stayed at the shop with her long after the streets of Syracuse had gone quiet, arranging bouquets for a Saturday morning delivery. The air would be thick with the scent of lilies and carnations, our fingers stained green from stems. Those moments felt like we were building something together, not just for her but for all of us. She would talk about expanding into event planning, about taking trips to New York City to learn from other florists. I encouraged every dream. But beneath the laughter and late-night coffee runs, I began to notice patterns. Evie was quick to celebrate the good weeks, buying little luxuries or taking Ryan out for expensive dinners, but just as quick to call me when the lean weeks came. The shop's books were never something she shared openly. If I asked about her profits, she would wave a hand and say it all balanced out in the end. I told myself she was just private about money, that it wasn't my place to pry. Over the years, the amounts grew. A few hundred became 1,000, 1,000 became several. We dipped into our retirement fund more than once. Thomas worried gently, reminding me that we had to think about our own future. I told him that once the shop found its footing, Evie would pay us back. She had promised as much on more than one occasion, her eyes bright and earnest. I clung to those promises, maybe because I wanted to believe the sacrifices were leading somewhere solid. Lily was growing fast, and my connection to her was one of the brightest parts of those years. She would spend weekends at our house helping me in the garden or sitting on the counter while I baked cookies. Sometimes she would come with me to the shop, a little apron tied around her waist, handing me ribbon or scissors while I worked. Evie would smile at us, snapping pictures on her phone, and for a while it felt like we were all part of the same steady rhythm. Still, there were cracks. I remember one winter evening when the shop was nearly empty, the snow piling against the windows. Ryan was in the back room talking on his phone, his voice sharp. Evie was at the counter staring at a stack of envelopes. She didn't notice me watching as she shuffled through them, pulling out the ones stamped in red. When she saw me, she quickly slid them into a drawer and changed the subject. I didn't press her, maybe I should have. By the 5th year, the line between helping and enabling had blurred beyond recognition. Our savings were thinner, and I had started cutting back on little things for ourselves. A vacation Thomas and I had planned to Maine was postponed. The bathroom remodel we had talked about for years was put on hold. Every time I considered saying no, I would see Lily's face in my mind and remind myself that stability for her was worth it. Looking back, I can see how deeply I tied my own sense of worth to being the dependable sister, the one who could be counted on no matter what. Evie leaned into that role, calling me with every crisis, big or small. And I answered every single time. I told myself I was helping her stand on her own feet, but somewhere along the way I think she forgot that was the goal. By the time 2022 rolled around, the shop was still struggling. The window displays were beautiful, but the customer traffic wasn't what she had hoped. Ryan had taken on a series of odd jobs, none of which lasted long. Their car needed repairs, the rent had gone up, and there was always another reason the numbers didn't add up. When the phone rang, I already knew it would be her voice on the other end, and I already knew I would say yes. That winter, a heavy snow fell across the city, the kind that muffles sound and makes every street look softer than it is. I sat in the living room with a cup of tea, the lamplight spilling across the rug, and thought about how 6 years had passed in what felt like a blink. I thought about the shop, about the bills, about the promises. And I wondered for the first time if I had been holding her up or holding her back. The call came on a gray Tuesday morning in February, the kind where the sky feels heavy and the snowbanks along the curb are crusted with dirt. Evie's voice was bright at first, asking if we could meet for coffee at the little diner on Oak Street. I agreed, thinking it would be a chance to catch up outside the shop somewhere warm where no one was rushing to arrange flowers or ring up customers. When I got there, she was already in a booth, her coat draped over the seat beside her and a folder sitting on the table. She smiled, but it didn't reach her eyes. We ordered coffee, and before the mugs had even landed in front of us, she opened the folder and began talking about the shop. Her words tumbled out fast about how foot traffic had dropped, how 2 big weddings had canceled in the same month, how the lease was set to jump by another 20% in the spring. Then she said it. $45,000. That was what she needed to keep the shop afloat. She said it like she had already done the math, like it was simply a matter of whether I wanted to see her succeed or not. I sat back, letting her words settle. 45,000. My mind ran the numbers automatically. Between our pension, Social Security, and what we had in savings, we could cover our expenses comfortably for the next 20 years if nothing went wrong. But taking that much out now would change everything. It would mean no buffer for the unexpected. No room for the trips Thomas and I had quietly hoped to take in our later years. Evie slid a piece of paper toward me. It was a rough projection of expenses and revenue handwritten in her looping script. There were no dates, no supplier quotes, no signed contracts. Just a list of numbers stacked neatly in 2 columns with a line at the bottom promising doubled profits by the end of the year. I asked how she planned to make that happen. She told me about a marketing campaign she wanted to launch, new cooler units for the shop, a delivery van to expand their reach. I pointed out that all of those things would require even more cash up front. She brushed it off, saying you have to spend money to make money. I took a sip of coffee to buy myself a moment. Then I suggested she think about downsizing, maybe moving to a smaller storefront in a busier part of town or sharing space with another small business. She shook her head before I had even finished speaking. That would ruin the brand, she said. Customers expected a certain look, a certain feel. I suggested she look for a partner or investor. Again, she dismissed it. She didn't want to share control. This shop was her vision. I could feel the knot in my stomach tightening. She had come to me with a single solution in mind, and if I didn't give her what she wanted, I could see the conversation slipping toward a place neither of us wanted to go. After we talked in circles for another 10 minutes, I told her I needed time to think. She gave me a smile that looked more like a wince and gathered her papers. Over the next week, she called twice, each time with a new angle. Once she mentioned how much Lily loved spending time at the shop, how losing it would break her heart. Another time she hinted at a wedding expo in Albany they could attend if only they had the funds. I found myself lying awake at night, staring at the ceiling running the math over and over. I thought about the past 6 years, about every check I had written, about the way she always promised it would be the last time. Finally, one afternoon, while Thomas was out shoveling the driveway, I called her. I told her I couldn't do it. My voice shook, but I kept going. I said we had to think about our own future now, that I had already helped more than I ever thought I would. There was a long silence on the other end. Then she said flat and quiet, "I understand." But when we saw each other a few days later, her whole demeanor had shifted. The warmth in her voice was gone. She kept conversations short, her smile tight and quick. Ryan barely spoke to me at all. It was the first time in years that I felt the weight of a wall settling between us. And I had no idea how much higher it was about to grow. The distance began quietly, like a door closing in another room. At first it was small things, a call that went unanswered, a text about Lily's school project left without a reply. Then the pattern became unmistakable. The weekly phone check-ins that had been a constant for years simply stopped. When I sent a message suggesting we get together for Sunday dinner, she answered 2 days later with a vague "we're busy" and nothing more. By the second week I realized she wasn't just busy. She was cutting me out. It wasn't only the absence of her voice that stung. It was the way she began reshaping the air around us. At the market on Elm Street, I overheard 2 women from our neighborhood talking near the dairy aisle. One said something about how sad it was when people didn't take care of their own. The other shook her head and muttered, "And after all, she's done for them." They didn't look at me, but they didn't need to. A few days later, Harold Kim from down the block knocked on our door. He had that expression people wear when they think they're doing you a favor you won't like. He told me Evie had spoken at the last HOA meeting. She had thanked the community for being so supportive during what she called a challenging family situation, and then said in a tone that Harold mimicked with surprising accuracy that there were people in her life who were more interested in keeping their savings intact than keeping family together. She never used my name, but the description was precise enough that no one needed confirmation. I stood there on the porch, the cool March air nipping at my arms, my face hot. Harold shifted uncomfortably, said he thought I should hear it from him before it spread further, then handed me the HOA newsletter like that could somehow make the conversation normal. After he left, I sat at the kitchen table for a long time, staring at the grain in the wood. I wanted to call her. I wanted to demand why she would humiliate me like that in front of neighbors I'd known for decades. But a part of me knew that confronting her now would only hand her more material to spin. Still, the ripples kept moving outward. On the Nextdoor app, a post appeared titled "Family First," with a few lines about how important it was to step up for loved ones even when it's hard. It was written under a username I didn't recognize, but the wording was uncannily similar to things Evie had said before. A neighbor I'd shared coffee with for years replied in the comments, "Some folks have more money than heart." Another added, "And they live right among us." Thomas tried to downplay it, said online gossip didn't matter, but I could feel it in the small shifts. Mrs. Lang, who always stopped to talk when she walked her dog, now gave only a quick wave from across the street. The couple next door who used to bring over cookies at Christmas skipped it that year entirely. The strangest part was how public and private it all felt at once. In person, Evie avoided me completely. She stopped dropping Lily off at our house. She canceled the standing Thursday night dinners without explanation. But in public spaces where she could be overheard, she left just enough in her tone or phrasing for people to draw their own conclusions. One Saturday in April, I saw her and Lily outside loading grocery bags into their car. Lily spotted me and waved with the open joy only children have, but before I could wave back, Evie shut the trunk and called her sharply to get in. She didn't even glance in my direction. That tiny moment lodged in my chest like a splinter. I started keeping a journal, something I hadn't done in years, just to keep my head clear. Each entry was a list of the things I'd noticed, the conversations that stopped when I walked into a room, the smiles that now felt forced, the absence of my name from Lily's school event programs. It was as if Evie had drawn a circle in the dirt, stepped inside with her own narrative, and shut me out entirely. In May, Harold stopped by again under the pretense of asking Thomas about lawn care. After a few minutes of small talk, he mentioned that at the last HOA gathering, Evie had brought homemade cookies and spoken warmly about the neighborhood as her real family. I could picture her saying it, the tilt of her head, the practiced pause. I thanked Harold for stopping by, closed the door, and leaned against it until my heartbeat slowed. That night, I lay in bed listening to the hum of the ceiling fan, thinking about how quickly the lines between truth and perception can blur when enough people repeat the same version of events. I had spent years helping her keep her head above water, but the story now circulating was that I had abandoned her in her time of need. By early summer, even simple errands had taken on a strange weight. At the pharmacy, a woman I'd once chatted with about gardening avoided eye contact altogether. At the library, the head librarian greeted me politely, but without the warmth she'd shown for years. The shift was subtle but cumulative, each small withdrawal adding to the sense that I had been quietly exiled from my own community. Thomas kept suggesting I let it roll off my back, focus on the people who knew the truth. But the truth felt smaller now, compressed into the walls of our home, while Evie's version roamed free. I told myself it was better not to feed it, better not to give her anything more to use. I didn't know it yet, but the Cold War she had started was only a prelude. She was waiting for the moment she could pull me back into her orbit, and she would choose that moment with precision. The call came on a warm Thursday evening in late August. I was in the backyard deadheading the petunias when my phone buzzed in my pocket. Seeing Evie's name flash on the screen after months of silence made my fingers pause midair. I almost let it go to voicemail, but curiosity got the better of me. Her voice was light, almost bubbling. She asked how I was, how Thomas was, like we hadn't been circling each other from a distance all summer. Then she said she had an idea. Ryan's friend had a cabin in Ontario right on a lake, and they wanted to invite us for a long weekend. She made it sound idyllic, like something out of those travel magazines in the grocery store checkout line. A few days away, she said, fresh air, fishing, Lily getting to spend real time with her aunt and uncle. She even laughed, saying maybe it could be a way to mend fences. I leaned against the porch railing, letting her words wash over me, and felt a tug in my chest at the mention of Lily. I had missed her more than I had let myself admit. It had been months since we'd shared a meal or a lazy afternoon making cookies. The thought of seeing her face light up was enough to make me ignore the faint hum of caution in my head, so I agreed. I told her it sounded nice. She sounded genuinely pleased, thanking me, telling me she knew I wouldn't regret it. The night before we were set to leave, Evie pulled into our driveway just after dinner. Her SUV headlights swept across the garage as she stepped out carrying a small navy blue suitcase. She smiled a little breathless and said she thought it would be easier if I took Lily's bag with us since their car was going to be packed with fishing gear and groceries. She mentioned offhand that Lily had a few delicate things packed in their art supplies and such, and asked if I could keep it upright and close to us. I offered to pop the trunk so Thomas could put it in with the rest of our bags, but she waved me off quickly, saying she'd already made sure it would fit just right in our back seat. I remember thinking it was a little odd, but I let it pass. Ryan came around the side of the car, then cheerful and full of energy, talking about how he'd packed his best fishing rods and couldn't wait to teach Lily to cast from the dock. His smile was broad, practiced, the kind that didn't quite meet his eyes. They didn't stay long, just enough to chat about the weather and the drive. Before leaving, Evie knelt beside the suitcase and adjusted the handle, almost as if to remind herself it was there. Then she hugged me quickly, her hair brushing my cheek, and told me she was looking forward to spending time together. After they drove off, Thomas came into the kitchen where I was rinsing dishes and asked if I thought this trip would be as peaceful as Evie was making it sound. I shrugged, drying my hands, and said I didn't know, but I was willing to give it a chance. The next morning, the air was still and cool, that particular end of summer quiet that makes you feel like the whole world is holding its breath. Thomas loaded our cooler into the back of the car, and I settled the navy suitcase right behind my seat, wedged between our duffel bags. It looked harmless enough, just a child's travel bag with a couple of stickers on the side. As we were pulling out of the driveway, I saw Lily at their front door, her small hand lifted in a wave. She looked tired but happy. Evie stood behind her, one arm around her shoulders, the other holding her phone. Ryan was already by their car, tapping something into his screen. I waved back, telling myself this was the first step toward something better. The drive started easily enough. Evie and Ryan followed behind us for the first few miles before pulling ahead near the interstate. We were supposed to meet them at a rest stop outside of Buffalo to caravan the rest of the way together. Thomas had the radio low, the hum of the tires steady under us. I tried to relax into the rhythm of the road, sipping my coffee and watching the miles roll by. We reached the rest stop just before noon. The parking lot was busy with weekend travelers, kids darting between cars, and the smell of hot dogs drifting from a food cart near the entrance. Evie's SUV was already there, parked near the edge. Lily was in the back seat reading a book. Ryan leaned against the hood talking on his phone. Inside the rest stop, we grabbed sandwiches and bottled water. Evie joined us in line, chattering about how perfect the weather was and how Lily was so excited to try fishing. But there was something in the way her eyes kept flicking toward the window toward our car that made the back of my neck prickle. When we stepped outside, I caught it. A fleeting glance between her and Ryan, quick as a heartbeat, followed by him nodding almost imperceptibly toward our vehicle. She caught me looking and immediately smiled, saying she was glad we were all doing this trip together. Back at the car, as I reached for the door handle, she leaned in just slightly and told me again to make sure the suitcase stayed upright, that there were things in there for Lily's art projects that could get ruined if jostled. Her tone was light, but there was an edge to it, like she was reminding me of something more important than it sounded. We pulled out of the rest stop together, their SUV in front this time. Thomas kept a steady pace, but I found myself glancing into the rearview mirror, not to check the traffic but to catch sight of that navy suitcase. It sat there quietly, its zippers catching the sunlight as if it were just another piece of luggage. The road ahead curved gently into the stretch toward the border, the trees on either side thick with late summer leaves. I told myself not to overthink it, that a trip like this could be a turning point if I let it. But even as I tried to focus on the scenery, the image of that quick exchange between Evie and Ryan stayed with me like a whisper I couldn't quite make out. Morning light spilled across the dashboard as we pulled away from the rest stop, the sky washed in pale gold. The air was crisp, carrying that faint bite that hints at autumn. Thomas had both hands on the wheel, his eyes steady on the road ahead. Behind us, Evie's SUV kept a careful distance, its silver hood glinting in the sunlight whenever I checked the mirror. About an hour into the drive, we pulled off at another rest area just before the long stretch toward the border. The parking lot was quieter than the last one. A few semis idling on the far side, the hum of their engines low and constant. Thomas got out to stretch his legs, and I followed, working the stiffness from my knees. Evie and Ryan parked a few spaces over. Lily stayed in the backseat, earbuds in, tapping her foot to some rhythm I couldn't hear. Ryan stepped out first, his sunglasses hiding his eyes, and walked around to Evie's side. She got out slowly, scanning the lot like she was making sure of something. When I started to walk toward their car, Ryan shifted his stance, moving just enough to block my view of the back seat and the luggage inside. His body language was casual enough to pass for coincidence, but deliberate enough that I felt the wall he had placed between me and that suitcase. I paused, pretending to adjust my jacket zipper, and caught Evie glancing at him. A small tilt of her head, barely noticeable, and his shoulders eased. Then she spotted me watching and put on that practiced smile of hers. She asked if we'd slept well, if the drive was smooth so far. I answered politely, but my eyes flicked past her to the navy suitcase in our car, still sitting where I'd left it, its handle angled just so. Thomas came back from the vending machines with 2 bottles of water and handed me one. Once we were settled back inside our car, he glanced at me and lowered his voice. He asked if something was wrong. I shook my head, not trusting my voice, but my gaze was fixed in the side mirror. Ryan was leaning toward Evie, speaking close to her ear, his hand resting on the roof of their SUV. Both of them turned their eyes toward our car at the same moment, then quickly looked away. The unease that had been simmering inside me for days started to climb, slow and insistent, like water rising. My mind replayed the past few months, the silence after I said no to the loan, the pointed remarks filtering through neighbors, the sudden invitation that seemed too perfectly timed. And now the way they seemed almost protective of that suitcase, as if it contained something more important than a child's art supplies. We got back on the highway, our car leading this time. The border was less than an hour away, and the lanes thinned as the traffic grew lighter. I tried to focus on the scenery, the open fields stretching toward the horizon, but my eyes kept darting to the rearview mirror. Every time I did, I caught a flicker of movement inside their SUV. At one point, Ryan lifted his phone, angling it toward our car, and Evie leaned in, speaking into his ear. Thomas noticed my distraction and asked again what was on my mind. I told him I was fine, but the truth was my stomach was tightening with every mile. Something about the rhythm of the day felt off, like a song with a single wrong note that keeps repeating. We stopped once more for gas in a small town just outside Niagara Falls. The station was nearly empty, a faded diner across the street, advertising breakfast specials on a flickering sign. As Thomas filled the tank, I stepped inside to pay and grab a coffee. From the counter, I had a clear view of our car through the window. Evie had gotten out of their SUV and was standing beside our trunk, her phone in one hand, the other resting on the handle of the navy suitcase. She wasn't looking inside, but the gesture was oddly possessive, like she was making sure it hadn't moved. When she realized I was watching, she straightened, smiled, and stepped back, waving like nothing had happened. I forced myself to wave back, my mind already fitting this piece into the pattern that had been forming since yesterday. Back in the car, Thomas handed me the receipt and asked if I wanted to switch drivers for the next stretch. I told him no, that I preferred to keep my eyes free. He looked at me for a long moment, then nodded without pressing. As we merged back onto the highway, the border signs started to appear more frequently. The closer we got, the heavier the air felt. My thoughts spun in quiet circles, the locked suitcase, the guarded glances, the way Evie had slipped so easily from cold distance to warm invitation. It was too neat, too sudden, and every instinct I had was telling me that the explanation wasn't going to be simple or harmless. The sun had climbed higher now, and the light caught on the zipper pulls of the suitcase through the rear-view mirror. They flashed once, sharp and bright, like a warning I couldn't ignore. I shifted in my seat, my hands tightening in my lap, and told myself I needed to pay attention to every detail from here on. The hum of the tires filled the silence between us. I could feel Thomas glancing at me from time to time, but he didn't ask again. Behind us, Evie's SUV kept pace, never falling too far back, never pulling ahead. It was as if they were tethered to us, each mile tightening the pull. By the time we saw the last rest stop before the border, I knew I needed to make a decision about how far I was willing to let this go. I just didn't know yet what that decision would look like. The green highway sign announced the border in the next 15 miles, the white letters crisp against the morning sky. My palms had gone damp, and the air inside the car felt close to still despite the steady hum of the AC. Thomas was humming softly under his breath, a habit he had when he was relaxed, but I could not focus on the sound. All I could see was that suitcase in my mind again, sitting silent in the trunk, the glint of the zipper under the light. The lane narrowed as we approached a construction zone. Orange cones lined the shoulder, funneling traffic into a single file. I looked in the side mirror. Evie's SUV followed exactly 2 car lengths behind, Ryan's face unreadable behind the tinted glass. My pulse quickened. I thought of the moment at the gas station, her hand on that handle, the almost imperceptible check of its position. A voice inside me, quiet but firm, began to rise above the churn of my thoughts. It told me to act, to not wait for the explanation, to not gamble with the hope that my sister's choices were harmless. The sound of it was so clear that I startled when I heard my own voice burst out sharper than I intended. "Stop the car. Now." Thomas jerked his head toward me, his eyes wide. "What?" he asked, easing his foot off the gas. "Just stop," I said, my voice leaving no room for discussion. "Pull over." We slid onto a narrow strip of shoulder between the cones, gravel crunching under the tires. The moment we came to a halt, Evie's SUV slowed behind us, her headlights flashing twice. A signal. A question. I ignored it. Thomas turned to me fully now, his brow furrowed. "Maggie, what is this about?" I unbuckled my seatbelt, my hands shaking. I need to see the suitcase, I said. Right now. He hesitated, but something in my face must have told him I was not going to back down. He climbed out and went to the back. The trunk opened with a soft click, the hydraulic arms lifting slowly. The navy suitcase sat in the corner exactly where I had put it the night before. I reached in, unzipping the main compartment. The first layer was what I expected. Lily's folded jeans, a couple of t-shirts with cartoon prints, a stuffed rabbit missing one ear. Underneath that, a plastic container of markers and colored pencils. It all looked innocent enough, but I kept going. My fingers brushed something hard wrapped in thick plastic. I pulled it into view. A rectangular package sealed tight with a faint chemical scent that hit the back of my throat. Another just like it lay beside it, and another. I counted 6 in total, each the size of a thick book. I froze. My mind did not need to guess what it was. Years of watching the news, the crime shows, the border seizures flashed in my memory. These were not children's art supplies. They were not wedding decorations or cabin snacks. They were trouble, the kind that could ruin lives in an instant. Thomas was staring at the packages, now his jaw tightening. Maggie, put that back and close it, he said, quietly, urgency in his voice. We are not crossing with that in our car. I nodded, zipping the suitcase shut, my fingers clumsy. In the mirror, I saw Evie step out of her SUV, shielding her eyes from the sun, calling something I could not make out over the rush of passing cars. Ryan stayed in the driver's seat, his hands gripping the wheel. Thomas shut the trunk with more force than necessary and walked back to his door. We are turning around, he said as he started the engine. No discussion. I climbed back in, my pulse pounding in my ears. Evie was walking toward us now, her smile strained, her steps quick. Thomas put the car in gear before she reached us. Gravel sprayed from the tires as we pulled away, heading for the nearest exit. Almost immediately, my phone began to buzz. Evie's name lit up the screen, call after call, then a string of texts. Where are you going? What are you doing? Just bring it across, it's fine. I turned the phone face down on my lap, refusing to answer. Thomas's hands were steady on the wheel, but his eyes were fixed straight ahead. Neither of us spoke for several miles. My thoughts were a jumble of shock, anger, and something heavier that I could not yet name. We passed the next sign for a turnaround, and Thomas took it without hesitation. The road curved back toward the south, away from the border, away from the quiet catastrophe we had just stepped out of. I sat back, the adrenaline slowly ebbing, replaced by a deep, cold clarity. Whatever Evie and Ryan were tangled in, it was bigger than any family favor, bigger than any history we shared. And now I knew exactly where the line was. Thomas drove with a kind of focused silence I had only seen a few times in our marriage, the kind where he was holding himself steady so I could do the same. The road signs for Syracuse felt like mile markers counting down to something inevitable. Outside, the late afternoon light had that muted, heavy quality before dusk, casting long shadows across the familiar neighborhoods we passed. But all I could think about was the weight of the suitcase in the trunk and the conversation I knew we were about to have. We turned onto Evie's street, the one I had driven down countless times for birthday dinners, Lily's school plays, and the holidays we used to share without tension. Now the tidy row of maple trees and front lawns looked staged, like a scene trying to pretend nothing ugly ever happened behind closed doors. Evie's SUV was already in the driveway, pulled in at an odd angle. The driver's side door was wide open and Ryan was leaning against the porch railing, smoking like he'd been pacing there for hours. Before Thomas had even shifted into park, I opened my door and stepped out. My body moved before my mind caught up, walking to the back of our car, lifting the trunk and pulling out the blue suitcase. Its handle was cold in my hand, and the weight of it seemed even heavier now that I knew what sat under those layers of Lily's clothes. Ryan's eyes narrowed as I carried it toward him. He straightened, dropped his cigarette, and grounded into the porch step with the heel of his boot. Evie appeared in the doorway, her hair pulled back, face flushed. The second her eyes met mine, the color in her cheeks shifted like she'd been caught mid-lie. Maggie, what's going on? I set the suitcase down on the porch boards, the thud of it making both of them flinch. I know what's in there, I said, keeping my voice level but letting every word land. She froze. For a moment she looked younger, almost like the sister I used to know, before her gaze flicked to Ryan. He stepped forward, his tone low and urgent. "You're the only one they wouldn't suspect, Maggie. That's why we needed you to take it across." "Needed me?" My voice sharpened. "You were going to have me cross an international border with that in my car. Do you understand what would have happened if they'd searched us?" Evie's hands twisted together. "We didn't have a choice. We owe Carla Jensen 30 grand. She gave us a deadline and she's not someone you say no to." I shook my head slowly, my throat tight. "And your solution was to risk my life, my freedom, so you could buy yourself more time." Her eyes glistened, but there was no apology in them. "You've always been there for me. You've always helped." "Not with this," I said. "Not ever with this." There was movement behind her, and I saw Lily peeking from the hallway. She was holding a half-eaten granola bar, wearing socks that didn't match, her brow furrowed in confusion. She looked between us, not understanding but sensing the air was heavy. Evie noticed and stepped to the side as if she could block her daughter from seeing me, from seeing the suitcase. Ryan glanced back too, but it was too late. Lily had already seen enough to remember. Evie tried again, her voice softer now, almost pleading. "Just take it back for the night. We can figure something out by morning." "Number." My answer came out flat, final. "This ends now." The quiet after that was loud. A car passed on the street. A dog barked 2 houses down, but all I could feel was the stretch of the silence between us. I turned away, stepping down the porch stairs, each wooden tread groaning under my weight. Thomas was still in the car, watching me through the windshield, his hand gripping the steering wheel. I opened the passenger door and got in, my pulse still pounding in my ears. As he backed us out of the driveway, I looked once more toward the house. Evie stood with her arms crossed tightly, Ryan beside her, both of them still on the porch with the suitcase at their feet, like an accusation neither of them could pick up. Lily's small face was still framed in the doorway, pale, and still her eyes following us as we turned the corner. We drove in silence for several blocks. The familiar streets rolled past, each one tied to some memory of Evie from years when trust wasn't a question. Now they felt like a map to a place I could never go back to. At the intersection before our neighborhood, Thomas reached over and rested his hand on mine. His voice was quiet but steady. "You did the right thing." I nodded, but the knot in my chest didn't loosen. I had drawn the line, yes, but the cost of drawing it was already sinking in. For the first time, I wasn't sure if my sister and I would ever stand on the same side of it again. The next morning, the air in the house felt different, like the first cool snap after a long summer. I woke up before Thomas pulled on my robe and went straight to the kitchen. The coffee pot gurgled as it brewed, the sound steady and grounding, and I used that rhythm to start making a list in my head. Every favor, every shared account, every document Evie had ever touched. I knew I couldn't leave a single crack open. Thomas came in, rubbing the back of his neck, and sat across from me. His hair was still mussed from sleep, but his eyes were alert. "What's our first move?" "We close everything," I said. "And I mean everything." I started with the bank. The woman on the customer service line recognized my voice. We had been with the same branch for years. I told her to cancel the secondary credit card in Evie's name, the one I had kept active for Lily's school fees. She hesitated for a second, probably wondering what had changed after so long, but she didn't ask. A few keystrokes later, the account showed only my name. Next was the gas card. That one took me straight back to the summer 3 years ago when Evie had borrowed it for a quick trip and never returned it. I closed it without a second thought. Then the utilities, water, electric, internet, anything with my name tied to hers. One by one I had them reroute to our own billing address. By the time I finished, the coffee in my mug had gone cold. Thomas silently poured me a fresh cup, a small act that felt bigger than it was. After breakfast, I called Denise Morales, our attorney. She had been with us through estate planning, property disputes, and even a couple of neighborhood HOA issues. Her voice was calm and direct as I explained what had happened. "Document everything," she said. "Dates, times, exact wording. Keep a digital copy and a printed one. If there's even a hint of a financial dispute later, you'll be ready." I scribbled notes on a yellow pad underlining the word ready. Denise also told me to freeze our credit with all 3 major bureaus. It was fast-free and would block anyone from opening accounts in my name. I went online and did it right away. 10 minutes later, I had confirmation emails from each bureau. Thomas headed to the garage to double-check the lock on our file cabinets, and I dug into the desk drawers. I pulled out anything that could be used against us: old statements, post-it notes with half-forgotten passwords, even that battered address book Evie used to flip through when she couldn't find Lily's social security card. I shredded it all. The sound of the blades chewing up paper was oddly satisfying. Just after lunch, the phone rang. It was Pastor Helen from church. "Maggie, I heard there's been some tension with Evie. Maybe this is a time to extend grace." Her voice was warm, well-meaning. But my grip tightened on the receiver. Pastor Grace is not the same thing as leaving the door unlocked for someone who's trying to break in. There was a pause, then she said, "I'll keep you in my prayers," before we said our goodbyes. By mid-afternoon, the kitchen table was covered in neatly stacked folders, each labeled and sealed. I kept a few legal maneuvers in reserve per Denise's advice. No sense in playing all my cards at once. Thomas came back inside with the mail, his hands dusty from the garage. "All clear out there," he said, setting the envelopes down. I looked at the table, at the piles that told the story of years of trust being dismantled in a single day. There was relief in it, yes, but also a hollow ache. I wasn't just protecting our money or our property. I was protecting the quiet, steady life we had built, and I was doing it knowing that the bridge between me and my sister might never be rebuilt. When the sun started to sink, I stood by the window, watching the light fade across the yard. It wasn't the life I had planned, but it was the one I could live with. And for now, that was enough. 2 months later, the phone rang while I was folding laundry in the living room. Denise's name lit up the screen, and the way she said my name told me this was not a casual call. She had heard from someone in our community that Evie and Ryan were planning a trip to Ontario on their own. No Lily this time. Just the 2 of them, and according to the rumor, a suitcase that sounded all too familiar. I didn't even have to think before I told her I would not be available to watch Lily. My voice was steady, but inside there was a knot of unease. I had drawn my line, and now all I could do was hope I would not be dragged into whatever they were about to do. That Friday night, Thomas and I had dinner on the back porch, the air heavy with the smell of grilled chicken and fresh basil from the planter. It was just after sunset when my cell phone buzzed again. This time the name on the display was one I didn't recognize. "Ma'am, this is Officer Brian O'Neill with U.S. Customs and Border Protection." I knew before he finished the sentence that the moment I had been bracing for had arrived. He told me Evie and Ryan had been stopped at the border early that afternoon. Officers had found several sealed packages hidden under clothing in their luggage. The description was so close to what I had seen in my trunk months before that my stomach turned. They were in custody, and the evidence was strong enough that the federal prosecutor was already negotiating a plea deal. If they accepted, they were looking at roughly 20 months in federal prison. I thanked him for calling, unsure if my voice sounded relieved or simply resigned. Before hanging up, Officer O'Neill said another agency would likely be in touch soon. It was the very next morning when my phone rang again, this time from a number labeled restricted. A calm, measured voice introduced herself as Carla Jennings from Child Protective Services. She explained that since Evie and Ryan would be unable to care for Lily and I was listed as her legal emergency contact, they wanted to speak with me about temporary guardianship. I set my coffee down, the ceramic mug landing harder on the table than I intended. "Is she safe right now?" I asked. "Yes, Miss Lawson. She's with a foster family we use for short-term placements. She's fine, but we believe the best option is for her to be with a family member she knows. That would be you and your husband if you're willing." I glanced toward the yard where Thomas was tightening the lid on the compost bin. He looked up as if sensing the shift in my voice. We had talked about this possibility before, late at night in bed when the house was dark and the thought of taking Lillian felt both heavy and inevitable. I told Carla we needed a day to make arrangements. She agreed and outlined the next steps: background checks, a home visit, and a court hearing to formalize temporary custody. Her tone was businesslike, but there was an undercurrent of urgency. After we hung up, I stepped outside. Thomas leaned on the porch railing, waiting. "It's happened," I said quietly. "They were caught. CPS wants to place Lily with us." He didn't look surprised. Just nodded slowly, his eyes fixed on the tree line at the back of the yard. "If we do this, we do it all the way, Maggie. No halfway, no second guessing." I thought of Lily's wide brown eyes, the way she used to curl into my side when she was little, whispering about school projects or asking for another bedtime story. I also thought of the mess her parents had made, the danger they had courted, and the fact that my name had been the shield between them and disaster once before. That night, I barely slept. I lay in bed listening to the hum of the refrigerator down the hall, the occasional car passing outside. At some point, I got up, pulled a blanket around my shoulders, and sat in the living room with the lamp on low. I pictured Lily's room, how I would need to rearrange the furniture, pull out the extra linens, maybe even paint the walls a softer color. By morning, the decision was made. We would take her in. Not because Evie wanted it, not because the world expected it, but because it was the right thing for Lily. When I called Carla back, she said she would start the paperwork immediately. Her voice carried a hint of relief. As I hung up, I realized that karma hadn't just come for Evie and Ryan. It had come for me too, in the form of a choice I hadn't asked for but would accept. This time, I wasn't stepping into their fire to save them. I was stepping in to keep Lily from burning with them. Lily arrived on a gray Wednesday afternoon, holding a small backpack and the stuffed rabbit I remembered from when she was 4. Carla from CPS walked her up the front steps, explaining in that even tone of hers that they had completed the initial paperwork and would be back in a few days for the home study. Lily's eyes darted around the porch before she stepped inside, as if she was checking to make sure the space was real. Thomas bent down to take her bag, and I watched her shoulders drop just slightly, the kind of movement that tells you a child is bracing for something and doesn't get it. We had set up the guest room across the hall from ours, with fresh bedding and a small desk tucked by the window. I showed her where the bathroom was, where the light switches were, how the closet door sometimes stuck and you had to tug it twice. She nodded at everything but didn't speak until she saw the art supplies on the desk. "Are these for me?" she asked quietly. "All yours," I said. Over the next week, CPS moved through their process. Carla came with a clipboard checking smoke detectors, water temperature, and the locks on the back door. She asked us about our daily routines, how we planned to handle school drop-offs, and whether we had a support system nearby. Background checks came back clean, and the safety plan was written out in triplicate. Maplewood Elementary agreed to take Lily mid-semester. On her first day, Mrs. Anderson, her new homeroom teacher, greeted her at the door with a smile and a laminated name tag. I stayed in the hallway just long enough to see Lily slide into a desk near the window and pull out a pencil from her bag. When she glanced up and saw me still there, she gave a tiny wave. It was the first one I'd seen from her in months. Weeks passed and I noticed the changes in small increments. She started sleeping through the night without the restless tossing that used to wake her. She lingered longer over breakfast, sometimes asking for a second helping of toast. Her grades began to steady and she joined the after-school art club, coming home with hands stained in blue and green from paint projects. One afternoon, she spread her drawings across the kitchen table. They were landscapes, mostly bright skies and rolling hills. I asked her about one in particular, a cabin by a lake with a dock stretching into the water. "That's where I'd like to go someday," she said, not looking up. I kept my voice even when I told her maybe we could make that happen. By early spring, the thaw was setting in and our neighborhood HOA held its monthly meeting in the community center. I went because Thomas couldn't, and I didn't want to leave our voting spot empty. As I took my seat, I noticed Harold Kim across the room. He caught my eye and gave a small nod. Midway through the agenda, Harold stood up. "Before we move on, I'd like to address something," he said. His voice carried enough weight that the side conversations quieted. There were things said last year that were not true, things that painted Maggie in a way that was unfair. I want to set the record straight. Maggie did more than protect her family. She protected this community. The room was silent for a moment before a few people murmured in agreement. I felt heat rise in my face but kept my hands folded in my lap. I didn't need an ovation, just the simple acknowledgement that the story had been twisted and was now untangling. After the meeting, Harold approached me by the doorway. "I'm sorry it took this long," he said. "I should have done it sooner." I told him I appreciated it, and for the first time in months I believed it. Back at home that evening, Lily was at the dining table with her homework spread out. She looked up and asked how the meeting went. I told her it was fine, that people understood more now. She seemed to take that in, then bent back over her math problems. When I walked into the kitchen, Thomas was pouring tea. "You seem lighter," he said, handing me a mug. "I think I am," I replied. "Not because everything is fixed, but because the air around us feels clearer." Outside, the streetlights clicked on one by one, and the hum of evening settled over the house. Lily laughed at something in her workbook, the sound spilling through the doorway. For the first time in a long while, the walls of our home felt steady, the rooms warm, the ground beneath us solid again. The letter from the court arrived on a Monday morning, tucked between a grocery flyer and a bank statement. It stated in plain language that I was to have temporary custody of Lily until Evie and Ryan completed their sentences. The paper felt heavier than it should, have the weight of responsibility and the quiet finality of a decision that would shape the next 2 years of our lives. A week later, a letter from Evie came in the mail. The handwriting was uneven, like she had started over more than once before, settling on what to say. She apologized in her way, saying she never meant for things to go as far as they did. She wrote that she had been scared, desperate, and foolish, and that she hoped one day we could sit in the same room without the past hanging between us. I read it twice, then set it on the counter. I felt no rush to respond. A few days after that, a letter from Ryan arrived. His was shorter, full of blame for the circumstances and the people he claimed had backed them into a corner. There was no mention of the risk they had put me in or of Lily's well-being. That letter went into a drawer unanswered. My replies when I sent them were polite and measured. I wished them health and focus during their time away. I offered no promises, no invitations, and certainly no money. The accounts had been closed, the access removed, and that was not going to change. Life with Lily settled into a rhythm. Mornings were busy with breakfast and the drive to Maplewood. Afternoons were homework at the kitchen table, dinner, and sometimes a movie. On Saturdays, we would walk to the park, Lily's laughter carrying over the sound of the swings. I began to see her shoulders loosen, her guard lower. She was finding a kind of peace I wasn't sure she had ever known. One evening, as we were folding laundry, she asked if she would go back to live with her mom after the prison term was over. I told her the truth as gently as I could. That it would depend on a lot of things, on what the court decided and on what was best for her. She nodded, folding a towel with more care than it needed. In the quiet after she went to bed, I thought about what it meant to love family. I used to believe it meant giving without question, forgiving without limits. But I had learned that real love sometimes meant holding a line, saying no, and protecting not just yourself but the people who couldn't protect themselves. Spring turned to summer, and Lily finished the school year with a stack of art projects and a certificate for perfect attendance. At the final HOA meeting before the break, Harold mentioned in passing that the neighborhood felt calmer lately. I smiled, not because of the comment itself, but because it reminded me how far we had come from that tense winter when every glance felt like judgment. As for Evie, we spoke only through letters, and even then not often. I had stopped expecting the relationship we once had. What I hoped for now was something simpler, quieter, built on truth rather than obligation. If that never came, I could still live with the life I had built here, with Thomas, with Lily, with the safety and steadiness of a home that no longer felt like it could be pulled out from under me. Looking back, I know that morning near the border was a turning point. Not just because it kept me from crossing into trouble, but because it showed me what my instincts were worth. That quick flicker in Evie's eyes, the way Ryan hovered near the suitcase, the heaviness in my chest that wouldn't ease until I said the words, "Stop the car." Those moments were the difference between losing everything and protecting what mattered most. I tell this story because I believe women's instincts are a form of knowledge we should never dismiss. They come from years of watching, listening, and piecing together what is not said. They have the power to change the course of a life, to draw a line before someone else draws it for you. So I will leave you with this. Have you ever had to set a boundary with someone you loved even when the pressure to give in was heavy? How did you hold your ground, and what did you learn from it? I would love to hear your stories, because every time we speak about these moments, we remind each other that we are allowed to protect ourselves and that doing so can be the most loving act of all.